1 Peter chapter 3, verses 1 to 7. Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives, when they see your respectful and pure conduct. Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry, or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husbands. Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. So Peter, as I mentioned 3 weeks ago, he is writing about the conduct expected of Christians. And he started off with all Christians, you are to honor your government. And then he moves on to Christians who are slaves. And then he tells them how they can behave so that they will win over their masters to Christ. And so now he is addressing husbands and wives. But he addresses the wives first. And it's probably because around this time, the early Christians, this is the beginning of the church, and the early Christians, many of them were poor, many of them were slaves, and many of them were women. And they may be women whose husbands are not yet Christians. So this is a situation, I think that's not just particular to that time. I think even in our modern societies, there are many, many occasions where you find that actually because the wife has become a Christian and the husband is not, and so there are tensions perhaps in the family. Now, even in our modern times, in our modern cultures with tensions, can you imagine during those times when Roman wives were required to be totally obedient to their husbands, and they were expected and they were required actually to follow the religion of their husbands. So you have this law and this rule in Roman society and in Jewish society, I'm sure, where the husband religion has to be followed by his whole family. So Peter is addressing a situation where, because of the preaching of Peter and the disciples, people are coming to Christ, they are slaves, but they have masters who, are over them. And then there are women who are married to husbands who are not Christians. So Peter was actually encouraging the Christian women to remain true to Jesus Christ, even if their husbands were not Christians. So it's a situation where the husbands do not obey the word. And it's not just simply non-Christians, but I think even Christian husbands who may actually ignore God's word. Yeah, they are not obeying the word of God. So this is a situation of primarily wives with non-Christian husbands, and maybe some of them have got husbands who are not very dedicated to Jesus Christ, who may nominally, their mouth say they are Christians, but they do not obey God. So the reason for submission in Roman society is, of course, you follow the law and you follow the culture. But here, I believe Peter has a different purpose for their submission. It's not just simply to follow the law and the culture, but because he says here that your husbands, by your conduct, your husbands will be won over to Jesus Christ. So it's about winning over husbands. And here it is without a word by your conduct. So winning over your husbands without a word by behaving in certain ways. Without a word can be the word of God, yeah, but without a word, I'm sure they, as husband and wives, they would communicate. But I'm quite sure in Roman times, as in today's situation, sometimes there are marriages that are on the verge of failing or have already failed, and the wife is not talking to the husband, and the husband is not talking to the wife. So the interesting thing here is that even if some do not obey the word, Peter says they may be won over without a word. So the gospel of Jesus Christ, the word of God, can be preached without words. It is attributed to Francis of Assisi, these words, this sentence, these two sentences, always preach Christ, if necessary, use words. Now, of course, historically, we cannot actually find these words written anywhere by Francis of Assisi, but there's a very, very good summary of what can happen in situations where we are commanded by Jesus to preach the word of God. But there are situations where you have to remain silent, maybe because of persecution, and in this case, because your husband doesn't want to listen to you. It could also be the wife. Yeah, a Christian husband without a Christian wife, the wife is not listening to you. What do you do? How do you preach Christ? You don't need to use words. And the words are replaced by your behavior, your conduct. And the word in the Greek word used here is anastrophe, which really can also be translated your lifestyle. So by your lifestyle, by the way you believe, by the way you act, by the way you live your life, your friends, your family can realize that, hey, you don't have to say it, I know you are a Christian. And in the situation of the Roman wives, of course, they were supposed to follow their husband's religion. They have rebelled by becoming Christians, and the rebellion continues by they are going to church and or maybe reading the Bible, despite the husband says, no, you cannot do that. So how are you going to be communicating with a husband who doesn't want you to be a Christian? Because you are rebellious and you are doing something unacceptable, and it is shameful to the husband to acknowledge to all his other friends that, hey, my wife is not listening to me. You know? So I think some of us come from cultures where that happens not in Canada, but maybe in the home countries that we come from. And always this idea, because the Roman Christians were a very small minority, that whatever you do, try and do in such a way that it doesn't disobey God. But even when you're obeying God, you can do your things in a way which does not cause offense to non-Christians. So this has been the tone of the letter from Peter from chapter 2 onwards. You can see in chapter 2, verse 12, it says that we are to live good lives, so that those who are non-Christians, they can see our good deeds and glorify God. And in chapter 2, verse 15, where he says that by doing good, we silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. So we do not cause offense. And here in chapter 3, verse 1, he says to the wives, by your conduct, you can bring your husbands into the kingdom of God. So why not do it? It's an evangelistic purpose. So the word conduct, translated as conduct in the ESV, let your conduct be holy and pure and so on. The NIV uses the word behavior. I think that's too weak a word. It's not just behavior. It is your lifestyle, the way you live. So your way of life is respectful. And I want to talk about this a little bit more afterwards from Ephesians 5, chapter 5, verse 33. The way of life, The wife must be respectful to her husband. She must be pure. Verse 2 says she must be pure. And verse 5 says she must be holy like Abraham's wife, Sarah. So all the holy women in the past, this is what they do. They submit to their husbands. And this submission is very interestingly described as a adornment. Verse 5, Sarah adorned herself by submitting to her husband. So the adornment is contrasted by Peter with external adornment, that's cosmetics. And I mentioned some weeks back that the word translated adornment as a root word cosmos, and cosmos is about the universe, it's about an orderly universe, and it's about, in a sense, decorating yourself in an orderly way. And so adornment here, as I mentioned, because of the word cosmos, that's where the English word cosmetics comes from, yeah? So our cosmetics should be not the external decorations, but the internal, and that is a gentle and quiet spirit, verse 4. Being gentle, being quiet, like Jesus, meek and mild. Jesus says, I'm meek and humble, right? And that's how we should aspire to be. And actually not just wives, but husbands too. Because our model of our lifestyle is the lifestyle of Jesus, who was a man, who was meek and humble. So like Sarah, our cosmetics should be internal rather than external. But our internal spirit, the gentle and quiet spirit, becomes manifest, become evidence in our conduct. And for Sarah, it was submission to her husband. And of course, verse 6, Sarah called her husband Lord. That was the way wives called their husbands in those days. So this is a hidden adornment. It is internal. Verse 4, it is the hidden person in the heart. So you have the external person everybody sees, but inside your heart, inside you is a hidden person. And if that hidden person is a beautiful person, it shows. It will show in the glow of the face. It will show in the way you talk, the gentle spirit, and so on. Now, very interestingly, last night in Singapore, it's Yuan Xiao Jie, the 15th day of the Chinese New Year. You are one day behind, so you are in Yuan Xiao itself, the 15th day of the Chinese New Year. The Chinese celebrate for 15 days, yeah. Koreans, we mentioned it, the Koreans celebrate for 3 days. I think the Vietnamese celebrate it for about that long, but the Chinese drag it all the way to the 15th day of Chinese, the first month, the first lunar month. So we were watching this television show, and there was this statement by the master of ceremonies, the MC. Chinese New Year, the 15th day of Chinese New Year is a Valentine's Day for the Chinese. And in the old culture, the women are to hide at home, but on the 15th day, if they're single, they go out. And the men who are eligible, they would look at all the eligible girls and decide who they like. And then they would tell the matchmakers to make the necessary introductions. So of course, when you go out, it's like once in a year, you have to put on your best clothing, your best cosmetics, and look beautiful and gentle. Now, the interesting thing is, one of the items in the show last night was this Teochew opera. And Teochew opera, for those of you who have not seen it, you don't actually know what I'm talking about. Essentially, Teochew, that's my dialect, the Chinese dialect of Teochew, actually is a very sing-song language by itself. And just speaking itself is already sounding like opera, you know. So, Churchill girls are supposedly very gentle and quiet because the language itself is so gentle and quiet and very operatic, very musical. So how do we become Christians who are, when we speak a word, it is musical, it's beautiful, and it is gentle. That's what Peter is looking at. So it is hidden inside the heart, but it is made visible in our conduct. And in verse 4, Peter says, this is the imperishable beauty. See, our hair will drop. I mean, my hair is already dropped. And some people would say, as I grow old, the hair turns gray. So to me, I always say, my hair doesn't turn gray because before it turns gray, it drops. Now, for ladies, many of you don't drop your hair, but some do. My dropping hair comes from my mother. My mother was actually, she had problems with her hair. She dropped in her 60s. My father's hair was just solid black in his late 70s. So hair will change to gray and drop and become unbeautiful. Now, jewels too. Jewels, they lose the value. They don't look less beautiful over the years. Maybe gold and silver can get tarnished, but they remain beautiful if you polish it a little bit, but they will lose value, perhaps. But in any case, even if they don't lose value, eventually when you die, they lose value to you, right? Because you don't own it anymore. Somebody else owns it. And clothes definitely rot. They definitely go out of style. They are perishable. All these things that we adorn ourselves with externally, they perish. But the internal beauty from the Lord, the Holy Spirit, is forever and forever. Now, I promised to come back to Ephesians 5, and that's the passage Paul writes regarding wives and husbands, and it's a much longer passage than Peter has written here, 7 verses. Now, in Ephesians chapter 5, verses 22 to 24, let me read that first. It's addressed to the wives. Wives, submit to your owners as to the Lord. Now, the ESV emphasizes both in Peter and Ephesians, the submission is to your own husbands. It is not a general teaching that all women must submit to all men, okay? And that has been the wrong teaching of the church over the centuries and some churches. And this is why the ESV, a modern translation, wants to make it very clear. The original Greek doesn't say all women to be submissive to all men. No, it's really about a husband-wife relationship. So wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. The submission is as if we are submitting to Jesus Christ. So the real submission is to Jesus Christ, not to our husbands, not to our masters, not to human beings, the emperor or the king. It is to Jesus Christ. And because we submit to Jesus Christ, this is the evidence of our submission to Jesus Christ. We are mutually submissive. Verse 21, Ephesians 5:21 actually says, submit to one another. Wives, submit to husbands. Husbands, submit to wives. Masters, slaves, submit to masters. Masters, submit to slaves, and so on and so forth. Okay, it's all mutual submission all the way. Now, verse 23, for the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its savior. So the motivation for submission of wives to husbands is because this is a model of the church. Christ is the head of the church, and the church is his body and his bride. So this is the model that somehow is a heavenly model which is replicated in the lives of husbands and wives. Verse 24, now as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. So we see here a very, very high standard of submission. Jesus Christ, we're told, submitted to the Father. Even though he's an equal, Paul tells us in Philippians that Jesus is God and he's equal to God. But despite his equality to God, he submitted to God the Father. Jesus Christ, the Son, submitted to God the Father. So just as Christ submits to God, and just as the church submits to Christ, that's the heavenly order of things. Wives, submit to your husbands. But that's not the complete story, okay? Because if you leave it there, that's how many generations of abuse of the Bible has come in, and therefore abuse of wives. Because if you read this alone, it does seem like wives are to be doormats. No, that's not. Because in this context, verse 21 says, submit to one another. And then verse 22 is a specific submission, just as the other part. Verse 25 onwards, there is submission. Now, verse 23, the standard is very high. It's the standard of Jesus Christ. How did Jesus do it? Wives, you do it too. Wow. So some of you as women and wives, you might say, wow, that's a very, very high standard, because the church is to submit to Christ. It's a total submission. Now, as Royston said some weeks ago, as a husband, he realizes that there's a verses 25 to 27 following. And this standard is hugely impactful, right? Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. And, you know, if you really have a truly Christian husband, and if you're a man and you truly want to be a Christ-like husband, you have to die for your wife. That is the standard that Jesus set, that you must be willing to die for your wife. And so it is a very, very high standard of love, which therefore, as I said before, if you have a husband who loves you that much, you will be willing to be submissive to him. Okay, so what is the husband to do? In verse 26, he might sanctify her, just like Jesus Christ sanctifies the church, makes her holy. The husband is to make the wife holy. How? Well, you make it possible for her to bring out the best in her, to bring out the Christ-likeness in her. You have to do things and say things that will encourage her. Let me say that I feel I have not reached that standard yet, but I want to continue to aspire for that and work towards it. And I know my friends who are, those of you who are listening, who are husbands like Royston, I mean, that you would really also try and do this. Now, the other thing that the husband is supposed to do is to cleanse her by the washing of the water and the word. This would mean your spiritual duties of, sanctification and teaching of the word and so on, and headship of the making responsible decisions that are Christ-like. So verse 27, Christ did all this so that he presented the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, holy and without blemish. Okay, so that's how Christ sanctifies the church, and how husbands must sanctify their wives. Now, the interesting verse is verse 33. At the end of chapter 5 in Ephesians, there's this interesting verse that summarizes the relationship of husbands and wives. Paul says, by the inspiration of God, I'm very sure, he says, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. Now, the thing I want to highlight here is not that the husband should love the wife as himself. Jesus said that, love your neighbor as yourself, right? Everybody, most people, love themselves very much. And when you love yourself, you should not just stop there. You should also extend that love to your wife and to your neighbor. So that's not that distinctive. That's not what I'm trying to highlight here. But the second part, let the wife see that she respects her husband. Now, as a young Christian, one of the questions I ask is, why is this difference? Why does Paul say, husbands, love your wife? Why he doesn't say to the wife, wives, love your husband? And I think here, is a very, very strong reminder of how you men and women are wired. See, I have to consciously tell myself, and my seminary professor reminded us all men, he says, I tell my wife, I love you 6 times a day. Sometimes I do it once, sometimes I do it 5, sometimes I do it 7. I don't consistently say that. But it's like when I was a young husband, I said, but you know I love you. Why do I have to say it? And no. The Bible says, no, you got to tell me. Because if you don't tell me, I don't know. But yeah, I mean, how can you not know? I do this, I do that. I buy you your favorite food. I take you out for a favorite show and so on. How can that not be enough? No, that's not enough. You have to say you love me. So husbands have to be reminded to express their love and to display their love, right? Not just display, but also to express it by words. So husbands, love your wives and constantly tell her you love her. But wives don't have to be reminded to love their husbands. They will love their husbands even though they are scoundrels. Mothers will love their sons and daughters even though they are wicked. There is no need to tell a woman to love the person she should love. But wives very often forget one thing. They forget to show respect to their husbands. You know, and that's how men are wired. Maybe it's maybe a result of the fallen world we're in, a sinful, broken world, but men have got huge egos. We need to be told you're great. Just as women need to be told they are loved, we need to be told we are great. And if other people tell you you're great and you're not, that's hypocrisy, that is flattery, that doesn't work. But the person I love, I need to have respect from her. If I love my wife and I want to be a good husband to her, I need her to tell me she honors me, she respects me. And when husbands lose the respect of their wives, the worlds crash. And sometimes it's perceived. The husband may think that I am not respected by my wife because she's too, she does a lot of things without telling me and not processing them with me and discussing with me and so on. So I actually have seen marriages break where husbands feel that they are the doormats because the wives are so clever and so capable and so on that even though they themselves are capable and so on, they feel that they are not respected and the marriage collapses. So it is also seen in the marriages of many of my friends' parents, and that is where especially in my father's generation, the husband and wife, they don't divorce, but they don't talk to each other. And they may not have talked to each other for 30, 40 years. So you get very familiar situations where the family sit around the dinner table, father is there and say 4 children, let's say. And the father will say, son, can you please tell mother, I think the pork is too salty. Mother did the cooking, please tell her. But mother is sitting right next to him. So, you know, they all communicate next to, while sitting next to each other, they communicate through their children. And the mother would have heard all that, and mother would say, son, you tell your father, go and cook himself. Go do the cooking himself. so, you know, because they have no more communication. And yet, in these relationships, I can see the wife is not walked out of the family because she still loves the family and she actually still loves the husband. And she would do things for him, clean his clothes, wash his clothes, wash his things, cook for him and so on, cook his favorite food even. So the love is still there, but the respect is gone. And yeah, true, it's true that some men do not deserve respect and you rightfully lose respect for them. But here is a general principle that if you are conscious of it, don't make your husband think that you're no more respect for him, even though you do. Okay, so husbands, even though you do love your wives, you need to tell them. Wives, even though you do respect your husband, you need to tell them. And let me tell you one more story again from the years of experience and ministry. Sometimes you think that husbands walk out of their wives and their families because they go to another more beautiful woman. I have seen men walk out of their marriages to women who are less beautiful than their wives. So it's not about beauty that they walk out. They because they lost, they feel that they have lost the respect of the wife. And here is this other woman who is looking up to him and say, "Oh, you're so clever. Oh, you're my hero," and so on and so forth. Yeah. So I think I exaggerate a bit, and maybe I generalize too much. But I think generally speaking, this is how men and women are wired. So Paul, writing with God's wisdom and direction and inspiration, tells us this is a very important aspect of a marriage. Now, back to submission. The submission in this case, man to the woman, woman to the man, because, when you love a woman so much that you would die for her, that is kind of submission. To me, that's a kind of submission. Just like Christ submitted to God and died for us. Now, such submission is not a sign of weakness. It is this determination, okay? It's a willpower inside us. The determination to do good in the face of evil. So verse 6 in chapter 3 here, we will do good and we will, so the element of submission here is to do good, not just to the husband, to the family, and so on. And it's just to do good in the face of evil. So even if you have a husband who is not very happy with our religion, with the faith in Jesus Christ, and so on, Peter is telling them, be submissive, be gentle, and meek. And verse 12 and 15 of chapter 2 comes in again. It is to win them over to Jesus Christ. And this submission is not weak because it fears nothing. Verse 6, it fears nothing. You do good and do not fear anything. So it fears nothing. It fears no human being. It fears no husband. You are a wife who submits. It's not because you fear your husband, because it is because you fear God. Chapter 2, verse 17. You honor the emperor, but you fear God. And verse 17 sets the tone. We fear no human being. Okay? So whatever we do is not out of fear. It is out of the motivation of honoring God. And this is the kind of submission that Jesus gave to God from a position of strength. He says, I am willing to be arrested. And he tells Peter, keep your sword. You think I cannot call on the angels and the angels will come? I can call on legions of angels. And one legion in the Roman army was 6,000 people. Jesus says, I can call more than 6,000 angels to come and save me if I really wanted to. But please keep your sword, because I am willingly going to be arrested, because I am willingly walking towards the cross, and you need me to die on the cross for you. And even though I'm going to suffer such a painful and terrible death and unjustified death as an innocent, I know God is on my side. And so from my position of strength, God will triumph. God is on my side. I will do good in the face of evil. I will not succumb to hate and persecution. And I will not take revenge. So verse 7 then, the duty of the husband, and this is very important, it starts with likewise. So just like the wife submits to husbands, husbands do the same thing. Do the same thing. Likewise, if you're a Christian, you must know this. Verse 7 has a very, for us men, verse 7 has a very, very deep implication on our lives. Okay? Other than the fact that Ephesians 5:25, Paul tells us our love for our wives is to be like Christ, our willingness to die for her. And how deeply then is your love for your wife? How deeply did Christ love his bride? He died for her. So how deeply is your love for your wife? Now, my wife likes me to tell this story, so I will tell this story. Yeah, how my wife tells the girls, when we have counseling of young people, and they say, okay, how do you keep your marriage going? We share from Ephesians 5, and she will start sharing about how her husband was willing to die for her. I actually didn't die for her. I actually didn't even face that much of a danger, but you see, one time before, I think, and Dorothy likes to tell the story. So anyway, since I'm here at the screen and she's behind me, so I'll tell it on her behalf. Yeah. See, we were living in London, and we were just me, Dorothy, and our little girl was just born in London. She was less than 2 years old. And one night she was, the baby was sleeping in our bedroom, because we have this baby cot, and the baby cot is in our bedroom, so that when the baby cries, we can wake up. So the baby cot is in our room, and the other room, we had 2 rooms. We had 3 rooms in the apartment. We had 3 rooms, including living room. So we had 3 rooms, and 1 bedroom, and the other room I use as a study, and then the living room. So we had been sitting in the living room, and then I needed a nail clipper. So Dorothy got up and said, oh no, I know where it is. Let me get it for you. And she went to my study room, because that's where it was kept. And she went into the study room, and I was in the living room, and suddenly out of nowhere, I heard this scream, this very, very, very terrified scream. It was like, I do not know how to describe it, very high-pitched and obviously very terrified. And I knew that was my wife screaming. I was wondering why she was screaming. I ran out from the living room, and I saw this huge man, Irish man, actually, I found out eventually, a white man, tall, 6'3", and I'm only 5'3", so he's 1 foot taller than I. And I saw this white man putting his hand around my wife's neck and strangling her. And at that point of time, I had no idea where this man came from. And he was so white, he was maybe even a ghost. I just ran at him, and I attacked him. And when that happened, he let go of my wife, and he tried to escape. He had come in through a window, so he was going to try and go out from the window again in my study room. I held on to him. I punched him, and I said, no, I have no more strength to, he's so big. I will just cling onto his legs and make sure that he would not leave this home, because I'm going to hold him till the police come. So that's actually what happened. And my wife opened the door. Long story short, neighbors came, and 8 men sat on this burglar until the police came. So looking back, I had the strength of 8 men to hold him back. And of course, my wife is very grateful. And therefore, she says, I'm worth loving, yeah? So I didn't die for her, but I put myself in a position of danger so that she could live. Now, Peter says in verse 7, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way. In the NIV, the translation is, husbands, in the same way, be considerate as you live with your wife. Be considerate. The Greek words here are katagnosin, according to knowledge. That's a literal translation. According to knowledge. Gnosis is knowledge. So It's not just living with consideration. Yes, husbands should be considerate to their wives. It's not just living with understanding. Yes, we should be understanding and be sensitive to the needs. And, once a month, there are some mood changes. Young wives, my wife no longer has a mood change. Well, actually, when she was pregnant with our baby, with our daughter now, she's 33 years ago. Before that, when I married her and when I was courting her, I had to be very, very careful every month, once a month. There was this period of a week where I had to be treading on eggshells. Treading on eggshells. But the year that she was carrying our baby, she was so meek and mild. She was so gentle. She was really so Christ-like. I loved that period of 9 months. And so, this is what Peter is actually saying. You live not just with understanding, but live with knowledge. So what's the knowledge? Of course, I mentioned in the first explanation several weeks ago, the word knowledge in Hebrew, it's an idiom for sexual intimacy. I know my wife, Adam, knew Eve. So Adam had knowledge of Eve. That means Adam had sexual intimacy. So sexual intimacy is within this word knowledge. Yeah, you need to have that intimacy and that consideration even in the sexual relations. But more than that, knowledge is also the knowledge of having lived with her, the experience of knowing her. Now, in our modern world, we have become very affected by the French Enlightenment idea that knowledge is simply cognitive knowledge, head knowledge, intellectual knowledge. And we dismiss experiential knowledge. So even in the church, there are many churches like my church in Singapore, very knowledge-based, but not very much heart-based, because knowledge is intellectual, it's cognitive. The words used is cognitive, is not affective. Affective knowledge is heart knowledge. But in the Bible, there is no such dichotomy. There is no such division. Knowledge is head and heart. The Hebrews look at knowledge as head and heart. Maybe the Greeks look at knowledge as just in the head too, but head and heart. So I know my wife not because there is a book written on her. In fact, one book is not enough. You need an encyclopedia, 36 books, maybe 40 books. But there is no book written on my wife, unfortunately. So how do I know her? I know her by living with her, the experiential knowledge, the affective knowledge, the emotional knowledge. So knowledge here then is not just I know in my head, but it is I know in my heart what she needs, what she loves, what she doesn't like, what she likes to do when she's tired, what she likes me to do when she's tired, and so on. So with understanding, yes, there's that part of it. There's consideration. I need to be sensitive to her feelings and needs and so on. But everything in love, agape love, unconditional love. That is all within the words kata genosin, according to knowledge. So the husbands have got a very, very important and very, very wide duty, to get to know your wives deeply. And not only that, Peter says you have to show honor to her. Show honor and respect, right? So respect is not just one way, as I mentioned earlier on. The wives need to tell the husbands are well respected. Doesn't mean the husbands don't respect the wife. They do also, they have to. Just that women don't need to be told they're respected. They just don't need to be told they're loved. You need to protect her. You need to protect her because physically she's a weaker person. Most wives are weaker, and most wives are weaker not just physically, but maybe in other aspects that and so you need to be conscious of that and to protect her. So my wife is very averse to conflict, and when she's in a conflict situation, I take over. I have to shield her. I have to shelter her from the conflict and the people giving her conflict. So that's what husbands do. They show honor, they protect the weaker, and they cherish the wife. And And why do you cherish your wife? Because verse 7 says she's heirs with you of the grace of life. She's a co-heir. She's a fellow inheritor of God's kingdom and God's grace, just like you. She is precious in God's eyes. So this cherishing has to be at the level of Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ loves her, and I have to love her just like Jesus Christ does. Whether I make it or not, that's another story, but I have to aspire towards that standard. And then finally, Peter says, you do this so that your prayers may not be hindered. Husbands, if you want to have a spiritual, prayerful life, first begin with praying for your wife and praying with her, for her, because you are the spiritual leader. You are the head of the family, not because you are the tyrant and authoritarian and what I say goes. And I say, bring my slippers. I sit down and you bring my slippers. No, that's not the kind of dictatorship Jesus wants us husbands to have. It's not the dictatorship that Peter is teaching here. You are the spiritual leader, just like Christ. You have to purify your family and be a moral example, just like Jesus is. Be a teacher of the word to your family. You are the priest. You are the high priest in your family. So how do we apply this in our modern world? The first thing I have to emphasize is because of this distortion in the world today, women are not to be oppressed or suppressed. Nothing in this passage, nothing in the Bible gives us men the authority to oppress women or to suppress the talent or abilities. And because maybe they are shy, maybe they are in some cultures they're not supposed to stand forward, we should be the one bringing them forward. Now, nothing in these passages also say that women are inferior in any way. The weaker vessel, see, we are all vessels of clay, men and women. But clay is a very, very fragile material. So men are weak too. It's just that women in comparison are weaker. We are all weak in the eyes of God. So there's nothing superior about men. We are all clay vessels, just that the women are physically less strong and therefore they should be protected. But it does not mean they are inferior in any way and that they should be kept inferior. No, not at all. They're not more stupid than men. They're not more ignorant. And in some cultures, it's because the women are not given education. Even in Singapore in the 50s and 60s, my father live in a generation where the daughters are not important. And in my family, we had 6 siblings. I was, I suppose, the cleverest, and then the next cleverest, or as clever as myself, was my little sister Alice. She was number 4 in the family, number 5 in the family. And she could have gone very far in university and maybe PhD or whatever. She's really clever, and she's a very good teacher today. She went to teaching school, and she became a teacher. Why? Because my father said, in Singapore, we can stop at the 10th grade. And when my sister reached the 10th grade, my father says, you go out and work now. You will not go to high school. You will not go to university. Why? Because I'm not going to waste money on you. He didn't say that, but his attitude was, I'm not going to waste money on you. You get married, you become you become part of somebody else's family. I'm not going to invest in you. So he never invested in his daughters in education. Not that it's good. It's definitely, it is definitely not good. But because he was a very poor man, he earned $300 a month, he decided to invest in his eldest son, myself. He didn't even put that much into my other brother, right? So so in the end, actually we were so poor, I didn't go to university myself. He couldn't send me to university, even if he wanted to. So, but the point is that in many cultures, maybe in many economic situations, when the family has to make a tough decision about prioritizing their resources, they may put it all into a son rather than a daughter. So in many countries and in many cultures, women are illiterate not because they're stupid, but because they have not been given the opportunities. But illiteracy of women is definitely one reason why they are hampered in their personal growth. And I'm very grateful that in Singapore in the 60s and 70s, when we became independent, the government in Singapore was not discriminatory. Scholarships were given to all good students, men or boy or girl, men or women. So we, in one generation, have got an education system that has educated a lot of women out of poverty into the heroes and heroines that they are. I want to digress a little bit here and also mention that it was Christians actually and Christian missionaries who were in the forefront of bringing education to women in Singapore and in Asia and brought them out of poverty into the modern world that we are all in. For example, in Singapore, we have a school called St. Margaret's. St. Margaret's is an Anglican school started by a missionary. She was on the way from England to China to be a missionary in China, and she discovered there were no girls' schools in Singapore. And so in 1842, this missionary started the first girls' school in East Asia. First girls' school in the whole of East Asia. And in 1899, a Singapore Christian, Lim Boon Keng, and two Singapore Christians, Lim Boon Keng and Song Ong Siang, they formed a school called the Singapore Chinese Girls' School, so that the Chinese girls in Singapore would be educated. 1899. The first two women doctors in China, the whole of China, were graduates of Christian schools. They were graduates of schools started by missionaries in China. And then the missionaries got together money. These two girls were so clever, the missionaries got money together and sent them to the University of Michigan, where my own daughter graduated from. And these two girls, Shi Meiyu and Kang Cheng, they became the first two women doctors of China, 1896. So women play a very, very important role. And in China today, definitely. And it all started because missionaries were faithful to God and said, women cannot be suppressed. That's not God's will. And they were given an education and they set the road to modernity that China is in today. So in summary, therefore, the biblical pattern is male headship. I mentioned that women do not need to be silent in church. They can be pastors even, but the pattern seems to be that the highest leader in the church congregation should be a man, spiritually, because we're also the heads of our families. And I suppose the contradiction will be, can you imagine if I go to church with my wife and she's a senior pastor in my church, but coming home, I'm her head in church, she's my head. I think it doesn't work. So the biblical pattern is male leadership spiritually and in families. And actually, this is not a privilege. This is a duty and a responsibility. And it's a very high standard because it's modeled on Christ. It is a duty that's very heavy and perhaps even onerous. And it has got to do with the function, not abilities, not intelligence, not capacity. My wife could be cleverer than I, but I'm still the head of the family because I am held responsible by God for anything that happens in my family, good and bad. Now, so to conclude, the Bible is not egalitarian. The world today wants us all to be egalitarian, meaning everybody is equal, everybody can do the same things. If a man can be a soldier, a woman can be a soldier. If a man can jump 6 feet, the woman should be able to jump 6 feet, you know. Everything and every aspect of life must be equal, and women must be part of it. That's egalitarian. And there's some pastors who think that way also. But I believe that there are indeed some things women cannot do, and there are some things that women can do which men cannot do, vice versa, both ways. God has wired us to do certain things. Biologically, we men cannot give we cannot have we cannot give birth to children, we cannot breastfeed, and there's some things that men can do which women cannot do, maybe largely because we're bigger and taller most of the time and stronger, right? So we have to recognize that biologically we have differences. And the reverse is true, that women can do some things that women cannot. Women can do some things that men cannot do. And I think generally speaking, for example, I think women are more resilient than men. I think that's the reason why men die earlier in many, many cultures and societies. Men have shorter lifespans, partly also because we're wired differently. Men keep all their bitterness and anger and pain all inside their hearts. They don't express it. Women express it to their fellow women every single opportunity they get. So they ventilate and they air and they don't keep it. So they don't poison themselves from inside. And they cry and the tears take out all the toxin. The Bible is not egalitarian, no way. But it is complementarian. Okay, what does it mean? It does not mean, first, that women are complete only with men. No, that's the wrong teaching. It doesn't say that women, you're not complete and you must have a man to complete you. No, it doesn't say that. Neither does it mean that men are incomplete till they have a woman. We can all live very fulfilled single lives, men and women both. It's just that God made us all different, physically, emotionally, and so on, and for different roles with different strengths. And as I said, I've seen so many women, they're so mentally resilient, so much more than men. Men collapse. They may look strong, but they collapse faster than the woman can. Husbands and wives, men and women are complementary. We have different skills, we have different wiring, personalities, and so on, that when we are put together, it's not that we are completed by being together, but it's like they say, for example, unity is strength. So even if you have more men together, more women together, somehow you're stronger. But it is also because we look at the world differently, our perspectives are different, maybe because that's how we are wired. So for example, I'm geared, maybe by my training as a lawyer, I'm geared to look for logic. I want to see a logic in everything I do, and if it cannot be explained logically, I will not believe in it. I will not move until I see the logic. But unfortunately, the world is built in such a way that not everything is explained by logic. There are many things about the spiritual world that just are not logical, cannot be explained by logic. So we cannot just, yes, the Christian faith is a very rational faith. It can be explained. Many things can be explained, but it is not all about explanation and logic. Some things, even in the physical world, defy logic. Quantum physics is a very good example. In the physical world, I've mentioned it before. We know that light travels in a straight line, but we also know that light travels in a wave. And they contradict logically, because if something is straight, it cannot be wavy. If something is wavy, it cannot be straight, but light can. The other thing is to, look at an atom, okay, simple atom, one proton, one neutron. And we think one electron, right? So we think that the electron is like the sun with a planet revolving around it. So that electron is moving round and round and round that proton, that nucleus. And so let's say we have a needle and we want to poke that electron, we're going to make sure we know where that path is, and then we poke it at the right time. But even though there's only one electron in that atom, the scientists will tell us that if theoretically you can use a needle to poke, you can poke anywhere in that direction, any direction, and you will hit that one electron. Defies logic. That means the electron is everywhere. That one electron is everywhere doesn't stand to logic. Now, I won't go into quantum physics. I'm not the expert in that, but it's basically to say that many things in quantum physics defy logic. Even the great Einstein himself, he said, I know this explains what I see, but I don't believe it. It's so hard to believe in it. Now, in my experience in my marriage, I like to look for logic. My wife sometimes says something different, the judgment may be different, and she says, I don't know how to explain it. And I said, if there's no logic, how can it be true? Now, she says, but it's my intuition. I just feel that this is wrong. And I said, feel. So sometimes I get misled myself, right? I say knowledge is both cognitive and affective. It's both about thinking and feeling. But very often I dismiss the feeling part of it. And my wife corrects me and says, I feel, my intuition. As an example, there was one time I wanted to dismiss an employee, right? And I have all the good reasons why the decision is good. But my wife corrected me by saying, but I feel this is wrong. Why? Maybe he has a family to feed. Maybe he has a reason why. And so it alerted me to another aspect of my decision, that maybe even if I want to dismiss him because he's not good for this position, maybe there's another position in the same organization that I can move him to where he can function better, or else to tell him enough notice so that he can go look for another job before I sack him. So I made a better decision because my wife's intuition kicked in, and she didn't have a logic for it, but she says, look into it, and I did. So remembering that finally, 1 Peter 3:7 tells me, it tells us all men, that men and women, husbands and wives, we are together made in God's image. We are co-heirs of God's kingdom. Genesis 1:27, right from the beginning of the Bible, we are told, male and female, God created us. So we are equal spiritually, even if we don't have the same functions or the same physique. Any questions?